My name is Cansu Hepcaglayan, and today we will talk about why the value of citizenship doesn't grant political obligations. The question whether there are political obligations, or more specifically, is there a duty to obey the law of one's country or state, has been an issue of philosophical dispute since Plato's Crito. Philosophical anarchists claim that there is no good grounds to justify political obligations, whereas defenders of political obligations present various possible grounds to justify them. For instance, the voluntarist picture claims that consent to a real or hypothetical social contract provides a sufficient justification for political obligations. Natural duty to support just institutions also has been presented as one of the justifications. Arguments from utility, from fairness, from gratitude, and various forms of combination of these justifications has also been presented. In this presentation, we will focus on a particular account that is called Associative account of political obligations that justify political obligations with respect to one's membership in one's polity. According to associative accounts, political obligations are special responsibilities one has in virtue of one's membership in one's polity. I will analyze associative accounts of political obligations in two groups. The first group is called analytic approach, and defenders of the analytic approach claim that obligation follows analytically from what it means to be a political member. So political membership by definition involves a reference to obligations. The second approach is called the value-based approach, and we will focus on this approach in the rest of the presentation. According to the defenders of value-based approach, political obligation derives either from the intrinsic value of political membership or else from another value that is generated by political membership, such as the value of one's personal identity, which is partially constituted by one's membership in a particular polity. So in the value-based approach, there is an intermediary normative concept that links membership to the obligation. Obligation is justified because there is this value associated with being a member to a political community. In this paper, I target one specific value-based approach to associative political obligations, and that is the account that grounds associative political obligations in the value of citizenship. And I will call this account value of citizenship account, VCA in short. I argue that the VCA undergenerates political obligations by overlooking commonly recognized political obligations had by non-citizen polity members. To defend this claim, I will argue in three sections. In the first part, I will explain what it means to ground obligations in the value of citizenship. So I will describe the value of citizenship account. In the second part, I will provide a working set of political obligations that we generally observe at a pre-theoretical level. And in the third part, I will discuss the political obligations of long-term residents. And I will argue that justifying political obligations by an appeal to the value of citizenship creates an unnecessary dichotomy between the special obligations of citizens and of long-term residents. And finally, I will close with some remarks about the implications of my discussion. Okay, let's begin. Value of citizenship account is a particular value-based approach on which special obligations among compatriots, among political members, are grounded in the intrinsic value of citizenship. I will base my formulation of this account according to Andrew Mason's formulation, because I believe that his formulation is the most clear and explicit one. He says that, and I quote, "Citizenship has intrinsic value because in virtue of being a citizen, a person is a member of a collective body in which they enjoy equal status with its other members and are thereby provided with recognition. And in addition to this value, citizens also enjoy the opportunity to contribute to the cultural environment in which its laws and policies are determined, and opportunities to participate directly and indirectly in the formation of these laws and policies." So these elements, equal status, recognition, participation to the formation of laws and policies, constitute the intrinsic value of citizenship. And Mason claims that special obligations among fellow citizens are justified by the good of the wider relationship to which they contribute. And since the responsibilities associated with political membership aim to realize the good that the citizenship intrinsically possesses. So he argues that we have these political obligations because they enable this wider good that the citizenship intrinsically possesses. And Mason is explicit that long-term residents do not fall under his conception of moral citizenship, because he believes that merely residing together, the relationship between long-term residents, does not have an intrinsic value where a citizenship relation does. Although residents, and I quote from Mason, "although residents, non-citizens, may influence public affairs," he claims, "they aren't part of the collective which makes law and policy and do not have the same opportunities as citizens in relation to these matters." Okay, this distinction between long-term residents and citizens will become more important in the third part of my presentation. But for now, let's pass to the second part. In the second part, I will try to provide a basic set of paradigm political obligations to have some framework to test whether VCA, value of citizenship account, is able to produce these basic political obligations. Theorists of political obligations are notably hesitant to provide a clear description of what these political obligations really are, and this is because the substantial degree of relativity that comes with specific political obligations in each country. So you may have certain obligations in country A and certain obligations in country B, and theorists claim that we are not here to defend a particular political obligation set, but we are here to show whatever these obligations are, they are justified. But I think this approach is risky, because I think without a working sense of the extension of the concept political obligation, any account of political obligation and its ground can end up being viciously stipulative. To avoid the risk of building accounts of grounds into our definition of political obligations, I will first sketch out a few paradigm cases of political obligation, and then I will proceed to test VCA in terms of its ability to generate these political obligations. So I believe that there are two groups of political obligations that are apparent to the ordinary moral opinion without significant dispute. The first group is called the rule obligations, and these obligations involve obedience to laws and norms that regulate the public institutions of one's polity. And the examples can be using public transportation, let's say, properly, obeying the rules of certain institutions, and obeying the law of one's country in general. The second category is I call service obligations, and these include the general services any member of a polity owes to the government of that polity, such as paying taxes, military service, and jury duty. And one may claim that The service obligations are actually a subset of rule obligations because actually these services are determined through law. And I would agree with that. That can be the case. But in here, I specified them in two different groups because I think they actually refer to different type of obligations. And I believe that any account of the grounds of political obligations should either be able to grant this basic set of obligations that I told you right now, the rule and service obligations, or else be able to show that why these obligations, which are obvious to the ordinary moral opinion, should not be considered as such. Okay, so now let's talk about how VCA, whether VCA is able to produce these obligations for long-term residents. So if the citizens of a polity have political obligations in virtue of their citizenship status, then either the non-citizen residents in this polity do not have political obligations, or the political obligations of non-citizen residents are grounded by something other than what grounds the citizens' obligations. I will examine both of these implications one by one and test their plausibility. But before, let me introduce you two characters. Citizen Kane is a citizen of country A, and long-term resident Meng lives in the country A for 10 years without holding a citizenship status. Okay, let's examine the first possible implication of VCA. If the non-citizen residents in this polity do not have political obligations, then Meng does not have any political obligations to the members of country A. The first interpretation of this sentence is that Meng is not obligated to perform any of the acts that are considered to be political obligations in country A. And that is obviously false, right? Because if we believe that Kane is obligated to obey the laws of the country and serve the government in the ways that is specified in law, then Menkes, as a long-term resident, is also obligated to perform similar actions as Kane. So the first interpretation obviously does not work. The second interpretation is that even though long-term residents share most of the basic political obligations with citizens, these obligations are not political obligations in their case, because political membership and therefore political obligation depends on citizenship. I don't think this interpretation is plausible either, because I think it is not a plausible idea to reduce political membership to citizenship. Historically and right now, in almost every polity, there are political members that share the same in political institutions and public space with the citizens, but do not hold citizenship status. Right now, these people are long-term residents, immigrants, refugees, and historically women and slaves were partaking in political space and civic life, but they did not hold citizenship status. So I don't think it is plausible to think that the only way to be a political member is to be a citizen. So the first pass failed, and I don't think it's plausible to hold that non-citizen residents in a polity do not have political obligations. The second pass is that the political obligations of non-citizen residents are grounded by something other than what grounds the citizens' obligations. And if that's the case, then Menck and Kane do both have political obligations to the members of country A, but the grounds of their obligations, their respective sources of justification, are different. I think this is a more plausible view than the first pass, but still, I don't think this works either. Given that both citizens and long-term residents share a similar set of basic obligations, and that they are political members that participate in public life to a similar degree, it seems arbitrary to posit a distinction in the grounds of their political obligation. Think of this example. Let's say both Menk and Kane, they're using the same public transportation vehicle to go to their work. In this scenario, we think that they have obligations to use this transportation vehicle properly, according to its proper rules, such as paying a certain amount of money, not distracting the driver, etc. But if the second pass is correct, then we have to say that even if Menk and Kane has the same obligations to use this device properly, the grounds of their obligations are different. And I think this distinction is arbitrary. There is no good reason to think so. But in Andrew Mason's account, Andrew Mason thinks that there is a good reason to think so, because he believes that actually citizens have significantly different obligations than the obligations of long-term residents. And he says, and I quote, "Mere residency, or at least mere long-term residency, might generate its own special obligations, but it does not generate the range that citizenship does." And he maintains that citizens do have obligations that long-term residents do not necessarily have, such as to participate fully in public life and to give priority to the needs of the fellow citizens. I will counter this claim in four different ways. First, I think it is debatable whether even citizens do in fact have the obligations that Mason introduces. It seems too demanding to me, and they weren't included in our previous basic set of political obligations. Second, it is unclear why, if citizens have these obligations, long-term residents do not also have them. Third, it is potentially morally problematic to hold that citizens have the obligation, ceteris paribus, to give moral priority to each other over other political members of their society, because I think this obligation might lead to discriminatory actions and policies. And finally, and I think this is my strongest objection to this position, even if it is the case that citizens have some obligations that long-term residents do not, it is unclear why this difference is a good reason to posit completely separate accounts of justification for the special obligations that hold among citizens and those which hold among long-term residents. And finally, therefore, I argue that an account that justifies political obligations with respect to the value of citizenship either assumes, one, and undergenerates political obligations by ignoring political obligations of long-term residents, or it assumes, two, which was that the grounds of political obligations are different for long-term residents and citizens. And if it assumes that, then it creates an unnecessary dichotomy between the political obligations of citizens and of long-term residents. And in my concluding remarks, I want to highlight that the same criticism applies to other value-based accounts that justify the political obligations with the value of a certain state that is not accessible to all obligation-bearing members of the society. For instance, Yael Tamir argues that political obligations are grounded in the intrinsic value of national membership or national identity. I think the same criticism applies to her position too. And I believe that a plausible way to overcome this shortcoming is to investigate the grounds of political obligations in the practices or activities of political members in general, not just those of members who enjoy a certain type of political entitlement or status, like citizenship or national identity. And I want to highlight that this paper does not reject the intrinsic value of citizenship or constitutive attachments. I just claim that this value is not a proper ground for political obligations. Thank you so much.